Thank you for coming back. I'm Rachel Gottlieb. I'm the Ruth Rippon Curator of Ceramics. I am not Scott Shields. Unfortunately, Scott, he at the last minute couldn't come because he's suffering from vertigo. And if everyone knows Scott, as I know Scott, he would want to be here. He's always here. And so it's really unusual for him not to be able to attend this panel discussion, because I know that working on the candy store, he was really passionate about working on this exhibition and the accompanying catalog. He enjoyed working with local living artists and collectors, but he was aware that this exhibition, while it was grounded in the local history, has international meaning and resonates with the world of art history and ceramic history. So I hope that you've all had a chance to see the exhibition and you've seen the film, as I have. And so we're fully versed now in the candy store and the wonderful artists. And what we're going to do now in the next 20 minutes or 30 minutes or so is we're going to have this informal panel discussion, and then we'll take questions from the floor. So before we begin, of course, I want to introduce our panelists. So to the left of me is Kelly Lindner, who is the Art Galleries and Collections Curator at Sacramento State. So she will be our voice of authority here. And then we have Sandra Shannon, who is a sculptor living and working in Benicia, California and Sonoma County. Her work, and I'm sure you saw the work in the candy store, reflects her experience as a graduate student in dramatic art. She completed her MFA in 1973 at UC Davis, where she developed a keen involvement in the object, the viewer, and the participant relationship. And last but not least, we have Jennifer Fisher, who is Adeliza's granddaughter. And so we're going to get a very personal view from Jennifer. And she is a garden designer and a California native who lives in the Bay Area and is surrounded by art. So these are our panelists. So the very first question, I think, is to Jennifer. And we...
Is it possible to speak up a little or to tune up the volume?
Okay. I'll speak up louder. Is that better?
Yeah, much better.
Okay, thanks. Jennifer, can you please tell us a little bit about what it was like growing up with the formidable Adeliza, your grandmother?
Yes, it's funny. It's such a funny question in a way, because she was so, part of my life. She started the Candy Store Gallery about when I was born. So it was hard to kind of distill down the essence of what it was like to be her granddaughter. But I guess if I had to say a few words for her, she was really a determined woman. And she could be quite relentless when she wanted you to do something or to, behave in a certain way. But I think one of her biggest characteristics was her enthusiasm. And she really built people up, people that were her family or the artists, or, she made you feel like you were talented and creative and really worthwhile. And I think those are characteristics that helped build my self-esteem, growing up with her. I think one of the most interesting things about her personality was that she's one of the only people I've known that she had no materialistic inclinations at all. She didn't care about owning any objects. I think she had 5 dresses and 3 pairs of Capezio slippers when I knew her. She slept on a lounge chair in the gallery. She ate off of a hot plate and a toaster oven. She didn't care at all about material objects, and she couldn't understand why people wanted to buy couches and TVs and things instead of buying the art. So any money that she had went into buying art, which she then gave to family members, to her brothers and sisters, and to me and my family, and to my cousins. And so that was kind of her whole life. She was really focused 100% on the art. I think also she was kind of an artist in her own right. She did this most amazing filet crochet. In fact, kind of in honor of her, I wore the top that she made for me, probably in the 80s.
It's beautiful.
I
was noticing.
You know, it's still,
Wow.
I think the style is still relevant
Yeah.
today. It's kind of timeless, but she had an eye not just for art, but also for fashion, and she used to get women's wear daily, and if I was at the gallery with her, we would spend kind of part of the morning going through, you know, what the latest styles were, and she was always super interested, and she would send me clippings in the mail to say, this is what you should be wearing, kind of avant-garde, right? She loved flowers. She especially loved lilacs. And when I was up at the gallery, sometimes in the spring, we would go drive up in the foothills and look for flowers that she liked, because she would pick flowers and she would hold them up to the paintings and she would say, take a look at this. This painting is as alive and beautiful as this flower is. So it was a nice kind of, you know, pulling in kind of nature and things that were really alive to give you that feeling that she felt for the art in that sense. So I think those were kind of the top reminiscences that I wanted to talk about her.
To share that with us. Well, Sandy, you talked a little bit in the film about what it was like working with or visiting Adeliza in the gallery. Can you tell us a little bit more about what she was like as a gallerist?
Well, I think the story I told about her going into somebody's house, I mean, I was very young. It must have been probably 1968 or 69. I had just become acquainted with the candy store, and she wanted me to come with her. It was easy to drive up there from Davis. And she took that painting off the wall of that woman's house and put on the Roy de Forest, and I want to tell you, I was mortified. It was so hard this way. But at any rate, I do want to touch on one thing about Adeliza that hasn't been spoken about, and that is that she was very political. And she listened to the Watergate hearings 24/7, whenever that was on. And she would call us and say, why don't you come up here today? We're going to listen to this. This is really important. It was quite amazing.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It explains in part, I mean, her selection of work, because I think a lot of funk is very political. It's not just about fun, right? So, and then how did you actually, who introduced you to the gallery or to Adeliza? Was it?
Well, I was never a student in the art department, but when I started taking classes, in the art department, there were two buildings. There was where the paintings and prints and drawings were taught, and where sculpture was at TB9. No matter where it was, there were always flyers up. And all the faculty talked to everybody. Well, you got to go to the candy store Sunday, there's a big opening. And so we would all go. And it was an introduction. It was really fun, and it really made it more real.
Yeah, that is interesting. Strong community. So Kelly, I'm going to ask you the serious question here now about abstract. How did abstract expressionism lay the groundwork for an artist like DeForest and other candy store members?
Yeah, I feel like we're doing a 180 here. All of a sudden, we're talking about art history.
I know, but it's good.
but it's an important part, I think, and you know, and especially here we have DeForest up on the screen, who had been studying at the California School of Fine Arts in San Francisco, which is now known as the San Francisco Art Institute. And at the time, in the 50s, the dominant style was abstract expressionism, and it had a seriousness to it that I think many of the artists that would later be identified with funk and nut art reacted against. It was that foil for them to go in the opposite direction, like this type of strictness, rigidity is not something that we want. We want more content. We want something that's actually more relevant to what our lives are. So in the case of DeForest, he of course is drawing from the landscape around him, the animals that he so adored, and his own quirky personality. I feel very fortunate having been able to work with him at one point, and I think many people will probably say this, that he always had this spark in his eye that you were like, oh my gosh, what is this man thinking? And what's going to come up next? He always was about the unexpected, and I think his work shows that. So for abstract expressionism really had that. it was that moment when change needed to happen. And so Bischoff, Diebenkorn, of course, returned to doing more figurative work after that, but for the students at that time, they even took that further. It wasn't just about changing a tactic in terms of what subject matter, but going even further in terms of their materiality, in terms of their conceptual approach, all of that.
That's fascinating, thank you. Well, Sandy, can you tell us a little bit about Bob Arneson's motivations in his earlier works, such as we see here? This is a collaborative piece, right? With
No.
Oh, this
these
not.
are
This
his.
is not
There
the
are
Roy
two
Webb,
different works owned by Forrest Merrill, which are here in the exhibition.
Right.
I'm going to read to you from Bob Arneson's, just briefly, the interview in the Archives of American Art. So this is Robert Arneson. Surrealistically, I had a notion about something erupting through the tank, talking about one of the toilet pieces. I had this kind of bump form erupting out of the tank and creeping over the edge with a little curlicue. Curlicues were always good. Solid surrealist Miro symbolism. I had to have that kind of thing coming down and circling around. So the next slide. These three pieces, I don't know if we have the photograph, but there was a photograph of Bob with all these pieces he's making in black and white in the studio. But these are some more of those surrealist pieces like the ones Forrest Merrill has lent. Signpost on the left, She, Horse, and Daughter, and in untitled form, which we only found out about recently. Somebody owns it on Orcas Island or something. I mean, it's really quite amazing how things circle around. I think Bob was always interested in art history, and we have an amazing thing from, I believe it was when he was at Mills College taking the history of ceramics, or maybe even when he went down to San Jose State. All these little pen and ink drawings of pieces that were shown, and then a description of them. And it's a real history of ceramics. It's quite detailed.
So, yeah. So tell us a little bit about your own work and your own practice.
Well, I want to, could we go back one? Is that the picture in the, no. So there's Bob at the Mate Foundation in 1978. And then here in 1980, a notebook sketch of something he was thinking of doing, which he didn't do. So you can see how that interest in Miro and surrealism continued. Okay.
That's good.
So as a student in design and then design for theater, taking art classes only toward the end of my undergraduate degree, I was always aware of that the object only had meaning according to how the viewer or then the participant participated in it. So in this is a kind of a later candy piece where somebody's been there and something's happened. Next. And there were a whole series of candies. I mean, this went on for years, and fondant. It all came out of a glaze class. Then I decided I never wanted to be a funk artist or a nut artist. Not me. So I started developing the figure about 1979, maybe 1978, 79, and this would have been before those. So the kind of figurative, hanging in space, partly wire, doing things with wire that attenuated lines that you can't do in ceramics. They would all break off, right? And kind of a pelvic form, so it hangs in space and has a relationship to your body. And then I went on with that, making somewhat larger pieces, all with hats, and most with shoes, and different kinds of body parts. The one on the left is position, which clearly relates to ballet, which I never did. And then there's an installation shot of some pieces from that group of work. Next. And then this kind of goes back, there's a little bit out of order, but it goes back to this, just working through how can I get ceramics off the floor, off the table, and draw with it. Because I do think that's one of the things that Bob took out of the Miro paintings, and certainly the ceramics he did with Artigas, was the ability to draw in clay. So I always extended that out more. Next. Okay, so these two would have been earlier. A plate of candy, just sits there from an 1880 cookbook I found in San Francisco. Well, I was supposed to be looking for a job, mind you. I buy an antique cookbook. And I did all of the desserts in it. And then this group of work, her mirror, it's really, I'd gone to live at my grandmother's house. She had gone to live at her sister's, and there were all these things in there, knick-knack stands and mirrors. And anyway, it was really reflecting about that and having a lot of fun drawing on porcelain or making illusionistic shelves and having illusionistic objects on them, and they would hang on the wall. Next. So then, finally, we were living in Benicia, and I was able to work much larger. Had a different kind of studio. The piece on the top left, her older self, her younger self, and her timeless male self, with the drawing behind it, of course, from a Picasso drawing, and me reinterpreting that. And I was trying to make little ceramic maquettes on a copper wire armature, sticking it into a block of wood I had so they would stand up. And it was just, I was beyond the material. And Mark Arneson, who then owned the Walla Walla Foundry in Walla Walla, Washington, was staying upstairs in the studio while he worked at Mary's, which was just up the street. And Mark came in one night with a bucket with a shade with a light on it and some microcrystalline wax. And he said, Sandy, if you try to make this over that copper armature and you use this material, by the time I leave here in 2 weeks, you'll have a whole show. And he was right. So those are the slower are about 12 to 15 inches. And then this is just more than life size. I started playing with different attitudes and forms and politeness and impoliteness and how it affected people. And sometimes it affected them pretty negatively. Next. And I also did a lot of work with vessels and the idea of the vessel as the body, the foot, the body, the neck, the lip, and the figure. So on the left is vestige M, protected by the vessel. The witch's M for the witch's Matisse. And the vestige M, a vestige F, unprotected by the vessel, which is supposed to be her vessel, right? Next. And I should say, the piece on this end and also on the other side there were natural forms, bamboo sticks on the far left, and on this side were just branches that I gathered and then reworked with wax. So I could get a different kind of line. I did continue to work in clay and do large vessels. That's about 28 to 30 inches high. Also with some copper pieces attached, but you see the drawing of the dancing figures. This drawing, Matt Chenoy, is about that time in some of us believe in the Middle Ages, in like around 1200, 1300, when there's a myth. Machino is a Chinese myth, but about Mother China, but that the snake went and drank the blood, the powerful blood from the vessel, and turned into a bird and took the power off to the guys in the sky. And this is the belly of the beast. Again, all bronze, all sticks with wax and other things wrapped around it and then cast. I think that's it, right?
That's it, yeah. I think so. Wow, what a dramatic change in your practice.
Oh, no, we have another slide. 'Cause
One
we
more
have
slide.
we have the environment.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's good.
So then I started,
Yeah, you said.
I was fortunate enough to, I had been married to Bob Arneson for a long time. And then I was fortunate enough to remarry. And it's a friend of ours, an artist, Art Shade, who's here, who actually went to Davis and taught at Sac State. And I was already working in bronze, but he had a foundry in New York State, and we were able to make all our own work and cast it ourselves, which is a huge thing, because casting in bronze is out the door expensive these days. So the piece on the left is Shifting Iris. It's kind of a skirt form you could get into. The viewer then becomes the participant. The middle is a piece that's not cast. It's wax over sticks, and it's all wrapped up in my studio. This is Southwood Swish. Again, just a great fantasy piece of a great dress with bow and flowers and cast in aluminum and out in the woods. So again, you're a participant there. And you can go to the Manetti Shrem, and there are two pieces in the courtyard, Copper Cage and Rosemary Place, that relate to these pieces.
Good, thank you. Well, I can really see how your work has evolved, and you certainly have less funk. I have to ask you this little silly question, but when you were working on the heart box too, were you thinking about it being on display in the candy store, and was there a little bit of irony going on there?
No. No. I was just making these things, and by the time I did the heart box, it's here, I had been trying to work. I was actually sort of babysitting Maya's house in San Francisco, Rainbow House, and somebody came down and brought me a bag of porcelain, and it was, again, hey, you're trying to make this in the wrong, this funky, low-fire white, cloppy clay. Why don't you try this porcelain? And it just changed how I was doing those things. And I did, many dozens of pieces.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Maya, because I have a question now for Jennifer. And I wonder if you can talk about what Maya and all the other artists meant to Adeliza. Were they, can you expand upon Adeliza's relationship with them? Wasn't just business, but personal as well.
Yeah, I think with her, her focus on the art and her enthusiasm and the fact that it made up such a big part of kind of who she was and her focus every day, that the artist became part of her family to a certain extent. And, especially Maya can talk to this, I think, more than I can, but Maya, I think, became kind of an informal partner with her because they did many projects together. They would do the Christmas cards every year, the beautiful Christmas cards that Maya would draw and then paint over, and they would send out. They would do other projects together that were really important to my grandmother. I think she was very close also to Gladys Nielsen, again, kind of like a family relationship. Gladys came out for her 90th birthday, which they had at the Palo Alto Art Museum. I think she had a fabulous relationship also with Roy DeForest. They were very close. He did a painting for her on the honor of her 90th birthday too, just especially kind of for her to kind of encapsulate what that relationship had meant to both of them. So I think that they were an extended part of her family, and they were extremely important to her. And family, too, was very important to her. She was really connected to her brothers and sisters and to her nieces and their families in a very profound way. And I don't know if this comes back to kind of the, her roots in the Mormon tradition, but family was a really important part of her life. And she had an ability to kind of encompass a very large group of people, too, as part of that family. So.
Yeah. Thank you. I think the film really captured that as well. So Kelly, the big question, why California? Why is California the birth of funk, and not moved over to Saskatchewan through the movement of people, but why not New York?
Well, I think I'm probably going to guess that most everyone here has lived in California for at least a certain amount of time. You may be the newest member here. But I think Phil Laniers really captured it quite well in Lawrence Campion's film when he was talking about there being a dearth of criticality in terms of criticism for artists to sort of react against, and so that allowed them a lot of freedom to experiment. And if you didn't have these sort of definitions about what art could be, you could create anything. So these artists really took that to task. They just said, okay, well, as Gottlieb did, he created an entire cosmology around frogs. And I mean, who would be bold enough to do that in New York? I mean, you would get shot down immediately. Even now, I think there's a certain rigidity in New York. Do you want to chime in on that?
Have you looked at Dan McCarthy's work recently?
No, I have not, but...
You have seen one of those glossy things in the New York Times?
Yeah.
There's a lot of funk going on right
Yes.
now, and the Mad Museum is going to be doing a funk show,
Yeah.
So
But I'm just saying back then, I don't know that this would have been received in any sort of embrace at all. So it's fortunate for us, in terms of the development of work in California, that this was able to happen here, especially with Sac State and UC Davis sort of being at the helm of pedagogy for this work, or where this work was happening. It trickled down to their students, and I think that continues to this day.
Right. Well, it was so strong, and Bob's vision for funk was so strong that he attracted artists, from Saskatchewan, so in Canada. So that's sort of the second major school for the funk movement. But that really leads to my next question, which is to Sandy, can you talk a little bit about Bob Arneson's relationship with his students? What kind of teacher was he like? Was he hands-on, or was he a mentor figure? Did he let them do their own thing?
It changed over the years. When Bob got to Davis in 1962, he was 32 years old. Mm-hmm. And the students were sometimes older than he was. So, and some of them had been students of his at Santa Rosa Junior College. And they all were great friends and buddies. And so I think there was a kind of equalness at that time, where they all worked and they all encouraged each other. Peter Vandenberg was there before Bob got there even. And then there was a time where he was always in there, but had achieved this level of success, I suppose, where students looked at him in a different way, and he was no longer playing football with them. Though he tried to keep up the poker games until somebody's dog jumped through the bedroom window, and I was in the bed. And I don't like that kind of dog too well. So anyway, that was kind of the end of that one. Then later, as he matured and was really getting ready, we had moved to Benicia. I wasn't up in Davis much, but I do think he was more achieved this mentor status. Mm-hmm. I think it changed over the years.
Yeah, he taught a long time. So
yeah.
Formidable, yeah, it changed. Mm-hmm.
I mean, he took a lot from his students, mm-hmm. and they gave a lot. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of back and forth. Mm-hmm.
Well, he started a whole movement, a whole school, through his students, right? And who became his graduate students and taught everywhere. So a question to you, Kelly. Please, we all want to know more about the Chicago Harry Who and what they meant to Sacramento State.
Yes, who is not to be confused with The Who, as was evidenced in the film, which is such a great anecdote. So in 1966, Irving Marcus was appointed the chair of the art department at Sacramento State. And working closely with the dean then, they were allowed to expand the art department from just 14 or 13 faculty members to over 30. And that's, I mean, as any of you can imagine, that is a huge jump, both in terms of being able to have more students, as well as to have more dialogue about the art, about what is happening in artistic practice. So Jim Nett was one of the artists that Irving Marcus invited out from Chicago, and Jim was part of the Harry Who, which is a group of 6 artists who had been making work sort of with similar aesthetics to what was happening with funk in terms of its irreverence, drawing from comic books and advertisements, pornography, and really trying to sort of upset what we would think needs to be the subject matter for art. And because Jim came out, he also then came with his wife, Gladys Nielsen, who was also teaching part-time at Sacramento State. So all of this new energy, just in terms of the general expansion that was happening within the art department, and with their energy that they had already had a name in Chicago that they were then bringing to Sacramento State, really, I mean, it was a huge impact, I think. I know that 2 students, Susan Adan and Michael Stevens, are here, and they studied with Jim and Gladys, and their work was greatly influenced by that, and they found their own voice within that conversation. What else?
Well, it leads to the next question, the difference between Sac State and UC Davis, and is there an aesthetic difference or very close community, lots of overlap?
I would talk about it more as a close community. I think we were talking a little bit about this earlier, that sort of trying to create this divide between the 2 institutions I don't think is productive, because there really was a community, and the Candy Store Gallery was at the crux of that, where all of them gathered, where they became friends, where they had conversations, they influenced each other's works. I mean, so I think, you could say that perhaps Sacramento State, because Jim Nutt and Gladys Nielsen were there, was maybe more focused on 2-dimensional, but I hesitate to say that because Peter Vandenberg and Ruth Rippon were both at Sac State at the same time, and Irving Marcus had his own unique style of painting. So each individual, showing at the Candy Store where they may have shared an aesthetic sort of perspective that obviously excited Adeliza very much. They all had their unique voices, and I think that it wasn't differentiated by where you were teaching at that point.
No. But they all embraced the figure as
Yes.
well, rather than prioritizing the vessel.
Yeah.
For sure.
Sandy, do you want to add to that, or Jennifer?
I think you're right. I mean, they socialized beyond the Candy Store as well. That was certainly what brought them together, but there was a lot of back and forth. I mean, it was great. Carl Weirsom?
Yes, was also I believe Jim Nutt invited him out to teach. He was teaching part-time.
Right.
He was also from the Harry Who.
Well, I'm going to open it up to the audience soon, but I want to give Jennifer just the last question. So you actually worked in the Candy Store when you were growing up, and what was that like?
Well, I did. I spent actually 1 6-month period when I was in between undergraduate and graduate school. My grandmother had gotten pneumonia. She'd smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day, I think, until she was like in her 50s, and she had emphysema, and so when she got sick, it could be serious. So I came up and stayed at the gallery for 6 months and kept it open for her. It was an interesting time. I think one of the things that was the most interesting about it was just having that relationship with the art when you live with the art, because I did the same thing she did. I slept on the lounge chair, cooked on the hot plate. It was weird kind of not having any of those, boundaries that you have between home and work. But the beauty of it was that you had this incredibly intimate relationship with the art, because you were sleeping next to it. You would get up and eat breakfast with it in the morning. And it wasn't, museums are fabulous places, but sometimes you have more of a distant relationship, right? There's the security guards making sure you don't touch anything, and it's not a very intimate relationship in that sense. So to me, that idea of living with the art and being part of it all the time kind of changed my relationship to art. And now I've inherited some of the pieces that my grandmother bought over the years too. And I have that feeling of that it would be really hard to live in a place that didn't have art in it of some form, right? That you're really connected to it intimately. from the standpoint of, I remember Maya bringing in a whole bunch of paintings that were not totally dry, right? You were racing for a show, and I was sleeping next to one of them, and I actually knocked into it in the night, and in the morning I was like, oh my gosh, how do I get those little things of, paint to come back? But it really does create that, then it's part of your life as opposed to something that's maybe you revere that, is separate from you. It really pulls it into being, and me not being an artist per se, it was kind of a profound experience.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. Well, thank you all. And Jennifer, thank you for wearing that shirt. I'm so glad you wore that white shirt. So maybe we can turn up the lights a bit and take some questions from the audience. So we have a question over there. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, there's one here too. Yeah, wait for the mic, I think, so that everyone can hear.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. Can you hear me now? Okay. First, I would like to say hello to Sandy Shannon House. I'm Maureen Miller.
Oh, hi.
I worked at UC Davis. You can tell because of my mask, but I had the good fortune of working with Sandy at UC Davis in raising the money for the very first endowed chair in ceramic sculpture, the Robert Arneson chair at Davis. So, Sandy, thank you so much for helping not only with that, but thank you as an artist yourself and all that you have done with Bob's work since. My question, I'd like to weave two questions in if I can. First, I'm wondering more about Adeliza's upbringing and how she developed that eye. What was her education? Where was she raised? How did she develop that eye? And then the second is, I never got the chance to go to the Candy Store Gallery, to those openings, and I really would like to know more from either Sandy or Jennifer what those parties were like, because I heard they were legendary.
Well, I could talk a little bit about at least the stories, the family stories that we were told about how she developed her eye. She grew up during the Depression and didn't have very much education, so I think I was told maybe like a 6th grade education. But when she married Vincent McHugh and she went to New York, because she grew up in St. George, Utah, so there wasn't a lot of museums or, necessarily high art culture in that community. But when she married Vincent McHugh, they moved to New York, and Vincent would take her out to museums all the time. They would visit museums over and over and over again, and as they said, the antique stores. But I think it was the museums, and at first she went in and she didn't like a lot of the stuff, especially a lot of the modern art. And as she went back more and more and more, it started to grow on her. And I think she claims that's how she developed her eye, and that in the beginning, sometimes she didn't like something, but she found that if she went back over and over and over again, she would start seeing different aspects of it, or it would grow on her. And that's how sometimes she would tell whether she liked art, because some of the art in the Candy Store Gallery was difficult at first to see. And some of it was so difficult, especially, take my word for it, when you're living next to it, 24 by 7. She'd put some of the stuff in the closet that bothered her, but she would still keep thinking about it and thinking about it. Then she'd pull it out and she'd look at it again, and maybe it would still be too much and she'd put it back. But that was kind of her, acclimating and educating herself on the art. And then finally it would be more comfortable and she could see the life in it and she could see kind of what the beauty was in it, and then it could become part of her, domain. But I think it was kind of that experiences in New York that really showed her what the world of art looked like.
And the parties?
You can tell more about the parties. I was young, I only went to a few of them.
If you were smoking dope, and there was a lot of that in the 60s, you stayed outside. You were outside. You were maybe on the porch, but more likely in the back, in the weeds where all the kids were. And it wasn't weeds, it was cultivated. It was vinca and bamboo and all that stuff.
And blackberries.
And at any rate, and blackberries. But inside, it was lemon cake. Her friends would come and make lemon cake and serve it. She would get these then we later found out they're collectors, and white wine and some kind of juice or punch. I mean, it was like, there was always something for the kids, and the kids loved the lemon cake. I mean, my son talking about it this morning, I mean, the lemon cake, or yesterday morning, the lemon cake.
Wow.
So it was very convivial, and it was very, in good weather, people would sit out on the porch and talk, or take a walk, in the middle of the opening, take a walk down the street and get a burger or something, come back, and it was just so natural and fun.
Yeah. So it wasn't like New York when you hear about the terrible rivalries and
No, it was absolutely the antithesis.
Yeah, isn't that interesting? Yeah.
It was not like that, and it didn't have, I mean, what Kelly talked about, or what Phil and Eris talked about, you know, there were no Clement Greenbergs, there were no Rosenfeld, there were none of those people here with the dogma from on high. I mean, that's what makes, it's almost like driving a wedge.
Yeah. So more questions? And actually, but one thing, Jennifer, do you have that lemon cake recipe?
No, I don't. My grandmother did not cook, so I don't think she made the lemon cake. I think she bought it from somebody, because she didn't have
somebody make it.
or she might have had somebody make it, because she did not have an oven.
Too bad.
And she did not cook.
Sorry. Okay, question.
At all.
I'd just like to add to what Kelly Lindner was saying about the interaction between UC Davis and Sacramento State. Many times, let's say it would be Irving Marcus and Jack Ogden, Roy DeForest, Bob Arneson, myself at times, I'm Art Shade. We would get together and we would fly to Los Angeles to go to museum shows. And Roy would be dressed like a carnival, and Jack Ogden would have long red hair and a green leather suit, and somebody else would have polka dot pants, and Irving would always have a three-piece suit, a hat, and an overcoat. And so whenever we went around, hair had just opened in LA, and we pretended to be part of that, and we would introduce Irving as our manager. But I'm just saying that went on many years. We made those kinds of trips, and it couldn't have been more collegial or more fun.
Great.
Thank you, Art, for sharing.
That's great. That's it. No more questions. I guess we can wrap up. I mean, I could ask this one additional question, which I think is really what I've certainly learned from this discussion today, is this incredible friendship amongst these candy store artists and how it really contributed to their profession as well. So maybe that can be our last question, and I'll give it to you, Sandy, about the sort of overlap between the professional and the friendship and how that contributed to this incredible practice here.
Well, I'm going to say it certainly existed among the candy store gallery artists, but it went way beyond that. And you'll see in the book that Bill Wiley showed a print or two there at the candy store, but he was a friend, and Richard Shaw was a friend, and it extended into the Greater Bay Area. I mean, Joan Brown, when she was teaching at Davis, she was a little less accessible because she lived out in Rio Vista, in my opinion, a place nobody should live. Anyway. And we became very close with her later. But it's just the openness of the Bay Area. It's easy. There isn't this thing of you have to have an appointment to even be able to talk to me. That exists in New York. It's even worse to this day. And now, anyway, it's just such a different attitude. Bob's friendship with Viola Fry, you know, not well documented, but certainly she was a great friend.
Okay. All right, we have good. Another question from the audience. Thank you.
Can anyone talk about the artist Joseph Yoakum?
he showed at the candy store. He's considered an outsider artist. But he was definitely, I mean, Sandy, you might be able to answer this better than I can in terms of when.
Who found him?
Well, I'm not sure who found him originally, but Jim Nutt brought him to Adeliza's attention and brought work out here of his. I don't know a lot more than that about it, but I certainly remember those Joseph Yoakams at the candy store. And now, you know, there's this very big, the Outsider Art Fair is going on, I believe, right now, this weekend in Manhattan, and it's changed a lot because the outsiders have become the insiders. And I don't know what else to say about it, but Art might know more about him.
I thought Nielsen brought the first Yoakams.
Nutt and Nielsen brought the first Yoakams out here, right.
But I was teaching at Sac State when they brought him out.
There was recently a New York Times article on Joseph Yoakum that talked about his origins. I don't remember what it was, but it was just like a month or so ago. I looked at it, so that might be a good source to get some more information.
This is for Jennifer. 2 questions. If she never cooked, how did the candy originally start? And if she began the candy shop about the time you were born, what's your earliest memory of the candy shop?
I think the recipe was an old family recipe because the stories that I've been told is that her mother, my great-grandmother, was a superb cook and they had a big ranch in Utah and she would cook for all the ranch hands. And my mother, who was raised partly by her grandmother, would talk endlessly about the amazing food that the grandmother would make. So I think that's where the recipe came from originally. And actually, when my grandmother moved to the Bay Area, she would come to my house and we would make it on occasion together. So I do have a recipe for that I can make. But she wasn't really interested in cooking, neither was my mother. And so I think, again, it was all this focus on the art that it really just took up all the oxygen for her. So she wasn't that interested. You know, it's funny, I have some vague memories. I think the clearest memory I have was when Maya and my grandmother came to visit my mother and I in the Bay Area, and I must have been, I don't know, maybe 12 or something like that. And Maya was the most amazing and beautiful thing I'd ever seen. She had this fabulous red lipstick and this rabbit fur coat and this silkscreen shirt, and they brought a painting of Maya's. I think it was one of the first things we had in our house, and I was just floored by her and the exotic nature of both the art and Maya's beautiful clothing and appearance and stuff. And that, I think, is probably one of my strongest memories that I have, at least of first being aware of the art and of the community that she had around her.
Thank you.
I remember it was so startling. I almost wanted to hide behind the couch and just look at her, because it was really fabulous.
Adeliza was an amazing force.
She was. So what was the key to her success? She wasn't a cook, obviously, we learned, but 30 years running a gallery and being successful, maybe, Maya, what was the key to her success?
She loved the art, and
she loved
the artists.
Mm-hmm.
The artists came first, and therefore they would knowingly give them work that they thought was special. I mean, if you bought work from the candy store, you weren't buying something that they'd knocked off on a napkin and said,
Cookie cutter, right? She used to talk about cookie cutter art, that she wasn't interested in, right?
yeah, that's a good phrase, cookie cutter art. And she was always pleased when she'd get a postcard from Vincent Price. And of course, Joseph Yoakum would always thank her. Like in the 1970s, she would send him $300, and she'd get a big note thanking her.
I bet she put $300 bills into an envelope with with one of those little recipe cards and say thank.
Did you notice that all of her checks always ended in 0? She never wrote, including the sales tax.
That's why it'd be so interesting if the Archives of American Art ever can get their act together and scan the records they've been given about the candy store. But almost somebody has to fund that. We could all probably get a GoFundMe account going and fund it. Huh?
Good idea.
I feel bad that I have to end the conversation. Time for one more question?
Sure.
I knew Adeliza when I was 13 before the gallery was opened. And one of the things that I really liked about Adeliza, she was a really good listener and a really good, thoughtful person, but she also really read a lot. I remember she read a lot of books like artist diaries and things like that. Do you know more about that?
I personally don't remember necessarily reading books, but she was reading magazines, and she would read the paper, and again, she got all of these different publications, and she was reading constantly, I think, to understand kind of what was happening, currently. And as you were saying, she was interested in politics. Politics were a big part of my family, liberal politics. And so she was always up on kind of what the latest trends and what was happening in the world. I think that was important to her life as a gallerist, too, to understand kind of what was happening and where things were going. So she was always, you're right, constantly pulling in information from many different sources.
But she did have stacks of books on that bench under the front window, and she had read them all, and she could talk about them with you. And she had her Book of Mormon, where she would sit up there and read it, and then she'd be cussing at President Nixon. I mean, it was just beyond belief. It was wonderful. It was so real.
On that note, I just want to say it was a real honor and privilege for us to host this day of film screenings, talks, and tours. Please join me in saying thank you to our panelists. And thank you for your wonderful support. I mean, if you do have more questions, feel free to go up to the galleries and enjoy the art and keep the conversation going. And just a reminder that Rachel's going to be in conversation again on March 20th. So thank you, Rachel, for jumping in at the last moment.
Good. With Alex Anderson, very different artist, but influenced by funk, for sure. Awesome. And his work is in Belonging, just outside the gallery, if you want to take a look.
So thank you, and enjoy the rest of your Sunday afternoon.